Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. Welcome to this conversation with journalists Leah Sotille and Kathleen McLaughlin. My name is Emily Benson, and I'm a senior editor for High Country News based in North Idaho. And High Country News is a magazine that covers the people and places of the Western United States. And I'm so excited to have Leah and Kathleen here with me today. Let me introduce you to our audience. Kathleen McLaughlin is an award-winning journalist based in Montana who reports and writes about the consequences of economic inequality around the world. She writes frequently for the Washington Post and the Guardian, and has also written for the New York Times, the Atlantic, and High Country News, among other places. She's a former Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT and has won multiple awards for her reporting on labor in China. Her first book was published in February, so exciting. It's called Blood Money, The Story of Life, Death, and Profit Inside America's Blood Industry. And it details the for-profit medical industry and how it exploits class divides. Thanks so much for being here, Kathleen.
Thanks, Emily. I'm excited.
Yeah. And Leah Sotille is a freelance investigative journalist based in Oregon and a frequent contributor to High Country News. She's also written for the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post, Rolling Stone, and lots of other places. Her first book was published last year, and it's called When the Moon Turns to Blood, Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell, and a Story of Murder, Wild Faith, and End Times. And it examines how a couple's extremist ideologies led to the alleged murder of 2 children, and more broadly, the way fringe and extremist beliefs can hide in plain sight, really. Thanks for joining us, Leah.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I'm so excited to have you both here today. And what I wanted to talk about today is, since you both live and work in the Western US, I wanted to talk about what it's like to do that, to be a journalist and a writer based in the West right now. And also about some of the projects that you two are excited about or working on right now. So thought we could jump in with the first question. You both published your first book within the last year, which is such an accomplishment, and congratulations to you both. And so I am just curious about what kinds of projects that kind of led to next for you, how you're thinking about stuff now, or Kathleen, I know your book just came out, so maybe a little bit about how that project is being received or what you hope it might lead to next.
Sure. I mean, I didn't really know what to expect when the book came out. Was that question for me? I hope I didn't hear that wrong.
Yeah, no, for both of you. Go ahead, Kathleen. Yeah, thanks.
I guess I didn't really know what to expect because I have written a book about something that I think is unsavory to a lot of people, which is blood. So, but it's been really interesting. I actually wrote a piece that's out in the Guardian today, kind of about the response to the book. And one of the things that's been really fascinating to me is that since I've been working on this project, the number of people I know or have met in the last few months who've told me that they sell plasma to get by or have done it, it's just kind of staggering how big this industry and this endeavor is. And I knew that going in, but I guess I didn't expect so many people who I know to have done it. And they didn't really talk about it previously because it's something that's a little bit hidden, a little bit stigmatized. And so I think if I hadn't written about it, people might not be so open about it. So that's been really interesting to me. There's been a lot of layers to it. It's been really interesting to see the class divide around all of this, which I also knew, but to see it laid out, if you are someone who's economically comfortable and all of your circles are economically comfortable, your friends and your family, you also might not know about this thing, even though it's millions of people every year in the US who do it. So it's been just and my book came out on February 28th. And just like the last 3 weeks even has been kind of educational about the way that Americans look at class. And part of the book, I should say, Leah and I both have books that involve Rexburg, Idaho. So part of my book does take place in the Mountain West. And the piece of that that's been interesting to me as someone who grew up here in Montana is seeing how much our economic divides have grown and increased in recent years to where this endeavor, selling plasma, is actually a thing now. And previously, it just wasn't that big of a thing. And now there's more people living in economic hardship. So we're seeing it, in our own backyard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The more I hear Kathleen talk about her project, and I think about the book that I wrote last year, there is this very obvious overlap of Rexburg, but I think, just hearing what you were saying, Kathleen, I think there is also this overlap of that they're kind of nasty topics that people don't want to talk about. Obviously the book that I wrote is about religious extremism, and I think, we were all raised to talk about that you're not supposed to talk about religion and politics, and like this book that I wrote is about both of those things. And it's, one of the things, I put my book out in June, and I think, I knew it was going to be classified as a true crime book. There is crime, there is a lot of death in the book, but I think that what that overlooks is the bigger conversations that are very Western and very unique to specific places in the Mountain West. Talking about the fringe ideologies that have been there for quite some time. So when I put out the book, I was also surprised to hear back from people. I didn't grow up LDS, so I don't claim that, but it's a lot about the Mormon Church and the history of the Mormon Church in the West. And I was really pleased to hear from so many people who were saying, thank you for giving us a reason to talk about this thing that we don't really talk about enough, because it's becoming more relevant with the kind of political divide we're feeling right now. So that's, I think, been a really surprising and pleasant thing, but also a hard thing. And I think, with the case, it's about the case of Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow, which is going to be going to trial in the next couple of weeks. I continue to see that talked about as a true crime case, and I just think that's really missing the point. But I think this is something Kathleen and I talk about a lot with being reporters in the West, is that you are constantly trying to say, yeah, but here's the actual point of why we should be talking about these things.
Yeah, there seems to be, like, to your point, there seems to be a propensity of people to look at the West through one lens only, right? And it's these ideas that they have formed kind of from the outside, and that's not what these stories are at all.
Yeah. Go ahead, Leah.
Emily, I feel like we've talked about this too, that, some of the things that we end up, you kind of end up being like a weird triage for the West sometimes when you're covering it, and you're trying to say, okay, I understand these stories that you're reading about have these huge stereotypes in them, but let me actually deliver you the reality of living in the West. We are not all wearing, cowboy hats and boots and, hopping on the horse to go to work. And it's kind of surprising to me how pervasive those kinds of stereotypes are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, that's like what we're always trying. That's like one of our main purposes at High Country News, is like dispelling stereotypes and like looking at this region in all of its nuance and all of its detail. And like, yeah, we're not all wearing cowboy hats and cowboy boots. Some of us are, that's okay, but not all of us, And I think like getting into topics that are kind of taboo, as you both do in your books, is a really interesting way to do that. It's reminding me of the podcast Death, Sex, and Money, and like how we need to talk about the things that we don't talk about. You could add religion and blood to that list. And it's so fascinating because everyone has experience of those things in their own lives, and to really understand it in a deeper way, like we need to be talking about it and figuring out more. Mm-hmm. So I do think this leads into my second question, kind of thinking about that in the context of the West specifically as a place that's often mythologized or stereotyped. I think it's you both have been really successful as journalists and writers, and you both live and work from here in the Western US. And HCN, of course, is based in the West. And as I was just saying, that's part of our mission at High Country News, is to talk about this place. But you have both written for publications that are, have national or even international audiences or scope, and are often, if they're based in the US, are based on the East Coast. And I'm just curious, like, what that's like as a journalist, when you pitch editors at other places stories about the West, they might not be that familiar with this region. Like, what's your experience of that been like?
I have to be careful. I mean, it is always, I feel like I'm always kind of doing a little bit of education with people. You know, the myths and ideology about the West are so pervasive. And things like Yellowstone have made that so much worse. And so trying to explain the place that it's not this one-dimensional kind of only white guys on cowboy hats. Like, you know, Montana, for example, we have a substantial indigenous population, and that's something that often gets erased. So there is kind of there's a lot of education that goes along with it. This is going to sound really strange, but I worked in China as a foreign correspondent for most of my career. So 15 years I was in China, and you always had to kind of educate your editors about the place when you were writing a story. And so I've gotten kind of used to that, but it feels familiar to being a foreign correspondent in some ways, even though this is the place that I grew up. This is the place where my family is, you know, this is the place that I know better than any other. I still feel like there is a lot of there is an educational component that comes with it. And to me, that part is not frustrating at all. I think that's kind of fun to be able to explain the place when you find an editor who really gets it and is willing to, you know, tell the real story. The frustration, and I think Leah shares this, the frustration I have is more in parachute journalism around the West. When people come in, don't know the place, and write a story that just perpetuates the myth and erases reality. So with my own work, it's usually been pretty fun. The frustration comes in watching work that isn't very careful about how representations of the West are presented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I 100% agree with Kathleen. I would rather somebody call me and ask me to help on a story, co-byline a story, write a story about the West before helicoptering in. Always would rather that situation. I think as far as, you know, pitching, I've written for, you know, outlets on the East Coast and internationally, to mixed results. And I think oftentimes, you know, I come across as an aggressive, angry lady with some of these editors because, you know, I can remember a time when I was writing a story, I write a lot about extremism, and an editor edited a story to say when Randy Weaver was killed at Ruby Ridge. And I was like, he wasn't killed. You know, he was, at that time, he was still alive. And I'm like,
Montana, like everyone does.
Please don't, please don't put this in a story. It's going to make you look terrible. So, you know, there's little mistakes like that that you end up having to be like, look, you don't understand the consequences of an error or something like that. I think one of the harder things with so much media being based not in the West is that, you know, you're pitching a story to editors and trying to get them on board. And you as the writer don't always have the last say on what happens with a story. So, you know, I've had situations where there have been ethical choices that have been made with pieces that had my name on it that, you know, I end up holding the bag in the end. You know, I live in this place. So if something comes across as not quite right or edited poorly, you know, an editor in London or in New York does not have to deal with the long consequences of that. So I think that that's, you know, more of a big picture media question is that, you know, there's so many shortages. I mean, NPR today is laying off hundreds of people. And this is so problematic when you remove bureaus from different regions. You end up just, you know, all journalism becomes helicopter journalism at a certain point. And I think that could be really damaging.
Yeah. And I think to add to that too, with the loss of local news and especially local newspapers, that used to be foundational information for national reporters who would come in. So they would have a plethora of local newspapers, local reporters who would talk to them and tell them what was going on, people who are really down in the details of community stuff. And that's really disappeared. And so I think a lot of times correspondents do parachute into the West and they've got nothing to go on.
Exactly.
Yellowstone, you know, there just isn't much else out there.
For Portlandia.
Yeah, I think what this is reminding me of, this is like a slightly different context than in the context in which you originally wrote it, Kathleen, but this is reminding me of a piece that you wrote for High Country News last year that was about the Berkeley Pit in Butte, Montana, and about kind of how a lot of people in other places are really fascinated by that toxic pit that's a remnant from the mining history and current situation in Butte, and how people sometimes will gawk at that in a way. And you coined this term in that piece, cultural extraction. And that the way that you define it in that piece is that it's taking away bits of history and community without providing any context for it, and kind of using those bits to your own ends in a way. And I think that happens a lot with stereotyped or mythologized places, and it happens in journalism too. And I think the problem is right there in what you wrote, like without providing any of the context. Like you need to, for readers to really understand a place, you have to put in the work to have that context and background in the piece so that people can understand it.
Yeah, and Butte is particularly, I would say, maligned place. It can be. I can remember when I was growing up, the mines were still operating. My, family going back multiple generation worked in the mines in Butte. So, I knew about that piece of our legacy that's part of my history. And when I was growing up, Butte was a joke to most people, or it was really, seen as, because it was a working class town. So there was a lot of classism within Montana about the place. Now it's interestingly become kind of cute to people who live here. And so it's shifted from this really like hard boiled, this perception of a hard boiled place to being this like, oh, isn't that quaint? And I think both of those things are equally offensive in a way, but it's been really interesting to see the shift in perceptions about this place and just the lack of knowledge about what it was. Again, not to go back to Yellowstone again, but right now Yellowstone is using Butte as a movie set to film one of its little offshoot ongoing serial movies. But Butte is actually made out to be Bozeman instead of Butte. And you really couldn't find two Montana towns that are more different. But the producers of Yellowstone don't care. It looks pretty. Butte has great buildings, and that's what matters to them. So it is always happening. I think that people see the West as a blank slate where they can reinvent themselves. And that goes for journalism as well. You can make it what you want it to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think one of the biggest problems too, I'm thinking about that line in Kathleen's story about the Berkeley Pit, is like that, okay, so you remove daily journalism, you don't have that context anymore. And then you're flying in reporters and they're coming and trying to get a story quickly. And I think, Emily, we've talked about this too. Like, what is the definition of helicopter journalism? At High Country News, we cover regions, is that helicopter journalism? And I think that, it requires time, and that is expensive, and you just can't make journalism cheaply. Kathleen and I have spoken in the past about that, what do we charge per word? It's even what it seems like a good price is still not enough to live in the West and make journalism that's thoughtful. And I think that's just one of the biggest tragedies of what we're facing right now when we talk about the political and social divides. It's a lot of this is because Kathleen and I talk about it. Maybe this is just our world, but it's when you lose journalism, you're losing a lot. And when you're trying to do it on the cheap, it's just a disservice at a certain point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's not sustainable. You can't build, historical knowledge and, really intimately know about a place or a story or cover something long term if you're doing it on the cheap, because you can't live on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. This is, when we've talked about it, inside HCN, or when I talk with writers or editors or you, Leah, about it, about what is helicopter journalism or parachute journalism and how are we, really trying to do something different. I mean, a lot of it is taking the time to spend time in a place and make sure that you're helping readers understand it through the lens of the people who are actually experiencing the place, like the people who actually live there. And I think, Leah, I think you did a great job of that in a story that you recently wrote for High Country News about Butte, and kind of about a big statue that's on the edge of town and what that means for the place and for the people who live there. And the reason I think that piece was successful was because you did such a good job of being an empathetic reporter and like spending time with people actually in that place.
Yeah, I mean, a story like that, thank you. I'm glad that I felt like it was a successful piece, but I think that when I think about it, I did my first interview on that 4 years ago. I kept coming back to Butte, and then the more people I met in Butte, the more I realized, like, if I get it wrong, I'm never going to be able to come back here. And I really like it here. So, and I like that. That's one thing that I think is really wonderful about Butte, is that people are not, somebody said to me, people in Butte are not going to shine your boots. And I thought that was a great way of putting it. Like, they had no reason to talk to me if they felt like I was going to manipulate the story in a way. But I was genuinely curious too about this 90-foot Virgin Mary statue and why it was there and why it's specifically, and it wasn't a clean story. I mean, how many times did we rewrite that story? 5, 6 times. So 4 years of reporting, 5, 6 edits, and I'm sure there's still issues with it, but I think that we put our best foot forward to put out a piece of journalism that advanced the conversation and talked about that this thing isn't just one thing to people. It's many, many things to a whole community.
Yeah, I don't think I could have written it, even though I lived it. I mean, I watched it be built and watched it put up. I spent a lot of time with you for the story.
Yeah.
I don't think I could have written it because it was too close for me. I mean, it's part of my life. So it was definitely, and that's an interesting thing as well. You're talking about you have to live in a place and people get mad at you, whatever. There is something about coming into a place from the outside that gives you the liberty to be a little more clean with your journalism, I guess.
Sure.
You're not so worried about what your neighbors are going to think of it. You know what I mean? So I couldn't read that piece, even though it is part of like my own personal history. It's too much for me.
Yeah, it's too close. I mean, I live in Portland, and I felt, there have been times I thought, should I be the person to write about certain things that have gone on here, or am I too close? And there have been people, I agree, that have come in and have gotten an issue. Part of, I think that the job of a journalist is to hold up a mirror, and sometimes people do not like what they see in it. And I've evaluated journalism about Portland in that way. Am I not liking it because I feel that it's not a good story, or because I don't like the reflection of myself that I see in it? I think those are both important questions to ask as readers and as writers.
Yeah, and I think like in a healthy media ecosystem, like there's room for all kinds of different pieces. Like, yeah, Kathleen, you couldn't have written the story that Leah wrote, but you could write a totally different, amazing story about that statue and about you. Like there's an infinite number of ways to approach the story, and like that's what I love as an editor and a reader, is like when we have all different kinds of pieces about a place.
Right.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to ask you both, I do think, we've touched on this a little bit, but I do think you're both drawn to similar topics. Like you both are really interested in power and inequity and class, and also like the culture of place. I think those are two themes that I see in both of your work. And I was curious about, first of all, if that resonates with you, if you think those are things you're drawn to.
Yeah.
And why are those things that kind of catch you that you want to approach as a writer?
Leah, you go first.
Sometimes I talk about as a music journalist. So like I just thought I was going to be a journalist, jumping in bands and going on tours. But I realized at a certain point that the work that felt most essential to do in journalism was about holding power to account. And now that we, like we're saying, we have these shrinking numbers of people, it feels like it's the only thing that should be done with journalism, is thinking about all of the issues that we're facing as a society. So, that kind of came later for me to work on issues of power. But I do think, place has always been a common theme in my work, just because I really like reading stories about place and writing them. I think it makes for a more exciting, as they say, like 30,000-foot view of a story instead of, the on the ground view. I really like doing that. But I think that in talking about the history of a place and what happened 200 years ago, it shows, I think humans forget that like our timelines are very short, And, 200 years is not a lot of years. And so it's interesting to look back on, like, Oregon specifically, what was happening here 200 years ago is still resonating. And, I think I just think that says a lot about a place. I really like diving into history and archives and going through dusty boxes that no one has looked at in a long time and trying to find those little, treasures that I think make a story, and kind of hold up that mirror, like I was saying.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's completely connected with where I grew up. Butte has always been a place where normal people are run over by corporate interests. And so it's hard not to have that shape you as a person, and especially as a journalist. My first job was my first newspaper job was working in the local newspaper in Butte when I was 15 or 16. And I worked in the darkroom developing film, which is not journalism, but I saw how hard reporters worked. And, this was a corrupt little town with lots of weird things going on. And the reporters were really committed to holding power to account. So it was a formative experience for me. And then I started out working in local newspapers covering government. I was a state house reporter in Montana for a long time. And I worked for a journalist who did that job for almost 50 years. And he was a historian. I mean, he was a credentialed historian, and his grasp on history and kind of the importance of placing news in its context really stuck with me from the time I was 21 years old. So I didn't really think about it very consciously. This is just, to me, what I thought journalism was. And I was very naive. I thought everyone did that. Like, I thought everyone who went into journalism was like, oh yeah, we're going to stick it to the man. But then I realized later that's not the reason that a lot of people are in it. So, and it's cool when you find people like Leah who are, but it's more rare than I thought when I was 21. That's for sure.
Yeah, same. My first job was in Cheney, Washington, which is a small town where Eastern Washington University is. And I'll never forget, like my first week on the job, people were like, I don't like reporters. I don't want to talk to reporters. And so, like, this idea of fake news, by the time that term rolled around, I feel like I'd been hearing that forever.
Yeah.
But I also realized there was such an opportunity for me as a reporter to, like, just spend time with people and show them that I actually cared and wanted to get the story right. Not to correct, like, the errors of other people in the profession, but to show, like, hey, there are some of us out there that really care about getting the story right, holding power to account, and making sure that we're all not just getting, bulldozed by the few.
And I think there's something so rewarding about when you write about people who don't have power or don't have money and they feel seen and their stories are reflected back to them. That's incredibly rewarding, just, on a personal level.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we have time for maybe about one more question. And so I wanted to ask, I have a specific version of this question and a more general version if you don't want to answer the specific version, but the specific version is, what do you hope readers would take away from your book, since you both recently published books, or if you're sick of talking about your books, kind of from your work in general, like if there was something that you would hope readers could take from it, what would that be?
Oh, well, for my book, it's really, it's very simple. I think that Americans need to recognize that we have a class-based society and we're very bad at talking about it. And we should recognize that because we're bad at talking about it, it hides a lot of problems and it prevents us from becoming a better society. So probably a grand idea, but that's my hope.
I think similarly, the story that I wrote takes a completely different look than a lot of people have at a case that's been talked about by Nancy Grace and every true crime podcast in existence. And says, the story that everybody's missing here is this is a story of extremism. I mean, in my mind, it's very clear cut. These are people who entertain religious beliefs that were, fanned like flames by leadership of the LDS Church, and then all of a sudden they don't want to claim them as their own. So I think that that's instructive for the ways that power inserts extremism into society and then doesn't want to deal the after effects of it. So, yeah, I think I want people to take away that the story that they think they know is not the story at all. It's something a lot more systemic.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so for people watching, check out Kathleen McLaughlin's book, Blood Money, and Leah Sottille's book, When the Moon Turns to Blood. Very different books, even though they both have blood in the title.
I mean, Kathleen, I think we should start a podcast called Blood and Religion. I mean, right?
blood, religion, and Rexburg.
Yeah.
Yes, and then, yeah, you can also check out both of their work in High Country News. Leah wrote about Butte in our March issue. So if you go to our website, hcn.org, you can find her work there. And Kathleen's story about cultural extraction, if you search on our website for cultural extraction at the edge of the abyss or Kathleen McLaughlin and Butte, you will find that story there. So thanks everyone for tuning in. High Country News is a nonprofit, reader-supported publication. We've been covering the West for more than 50 years, and we can't do that work without you. So if you want to support our work, go to our website, hcn.org, where you can read more of our work and subscribe or donate. And you can also find us on all the social media at High Country News, @High Country News. And you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Benson, BENSON1. And Kathleen and Leah, what's the best way for folks to find more of your work online? Where can we do that?
I'm kind of scattered all over the place, so my Twitter feed is probably the best. It's at KENC.
I'm on Twitter too. It's Leah_Sotille, 2 T's, 1 L. I also have a Substack newsletter that people can subscribe to that I put out once a month.
Cool. Well, thanks very much. Thanks to you both for joining me. Thanks to the audience for watching and listening. And yeah, I'll keep an eye out for that new podcast from YouTube.
Thanks, Emily. It's fun to talk to you guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.